Anomalous Transmission 2, Damage Control, a rebuttal to the Wall Street Journal. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. By now, many of you have very likely seen the recent Wall Street Journal article discussing alleged Pentagon disinformation said to have fueled America's UFO mythology. The New York Post also put out their own article, and that pretty much covers the same beats as the Wall Street Journal piece. I have a lot to unpack here, but I'm going to employ a bit of a unique methodology and approach it from two very deliberate but different angles. First, we're going to deconstruct the piece, essentially tear it down, and then we'll reconstruct it and try to transform what many might view right now as a negative into a potential step forward. By the end of this transmission, I think you'll understand what I'm getting at. The recent Wall Street Journal article entitled "The Pentagon Disinformation That Fueled America's UFO Mythology" is the latest in a long line of desperate attempts to steer public discourse away from what is actually unfolding. Rather than advance our understanding of the phenomenon, the piece seeks to reduce decades of credible, global, and deeply impactful encounters with unknown intelligences to nothing more than psychological artifacts of Cold War secrecy. This is narrative manipulation, carefully curated to distract, to distort, and to derail momentum at a time when unprecedented public interest is demanding answers. What the article appears to be aiming for is a subtle reconditioning of public perception, encouraging readers to interpret the entire UFO narrative as little more than the byproduct of fabricated rumors seeded within military circles. While it stops short of stating this outright, it relies heavily on the brevity of modern attention spans to let the implication linger unchallenged. Yes, there have undoubtedly been instances of deliberate deception. We all know this. But to conflate those isolated cases with the entirety of the phenomenon is, quite frankly, bullshit. It's disingenuous. It ignores the larger, more complex picture in favor of a convenient oversimplification. Let's begin by stating plainly, we are being visited and interacted with by non-human intelligence. This is not a theory. It is a conclusion reached after exhaustive research, testimony, data analysis, and historic correlation. And what is most revealing about the Wall Street Journal's attempt to debunk this reality is what it deliberately omits: the vast body of testimony from whistleblowers, the ever-changing official narratives, the history of institutional dishonesty, and the unbroken line of encounters that stretches back into antiquity. The article leans heavily into the notion that UFOs are a byproduct of military disinformation campaigns designed to shield classified aerospace programs. But this conveniently ignores a broader truth. The US government has repeatedly lied about this subject, often under oath, and only adjusts its position when incontrovertible evidence is brought to public light. The history of UFO secrecy is not one of passive misunderstanding. It is one of active obfuscation. The Wall Street Journal article presents a strategic reframing maneuver, a disinformation nested within a confession. While appearing to offer transparency, it selectively acknowledges limited deception, for example, doctored photos or pranks even, to reabsorb public suspicion into state-managed narratives. This is a textbook, modified, limited hangout. By conceding that the Pentagon seeded UFO myths to mask stealth programs, the article seeks to redirect the origin of the phenomenon from actual anomalous events to psychological manipulation. There's a problem with that, though. This deflection collapses when cross-referenced with historical patterns of response asymmetry, forensic inconsistencies, and testimonial convergence. The piece omits the vast archival and scientific signal. It does not address isotopic forensics on metamaterials, which demonstrate non-terrestrial signatures beyond industrial capacity. It bypasses the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, under which non-human propulsion systems are classifiable as restricted data, locking them out of public view indefinitely. It ignores the Wilson-Davis memo and David Grush's congressional testimony detailing crash retrieval programs, non-human biologics, and contractor-laundered SAP containment. The article references electromagnetic pulse tests as the explanation for the 1967 nuclear missile shutdowns at Malmstrom Air Force Base, but internal inconsistencies remain. If these were domestic EMP trials, why were missile officers like Robert Salas not briefed? Even decades later, why issue gag orders, threats of execution, and immediate helicopter extraction for a controlled U.S. test? Such treatment is asymmetrical for an internal operation. We're expected to believe that a live EMP trial targeting operational nuclear missiles was carried out in total secrecy from the very personnel responsible for overseeing them? If that sounds implausible, that's because it is. The explanation strains credibility to such an extent that it borders on the absurd. And yet, it's offered here as though it neatly resolves one of the most unsettling incidents in nuclear weapons history. Further, the article attributes decades of high strangeness UFO events to confusion, pranks, or misidentification, but cannot reconcile this with persistent radar-confirmed incursions into restricted airspace. For example, the 2004 USS Nimitz incident or the 2014 USS Roosevelt case. It also ignores the 1952 Washington, D.C. overflights tracked on radar, chased by jets, which prompted CIA involvement and the Robertson panel's recommendation to debunk and discredit public sightings. That event alone invalidates the psychological operations origin theory. The article's central strategy is a clever attempt at the reversal of truth perception, an inversion of the actual evidentiary landscape. It claims the myth was seeded by the state to obscure Earth-based tech, when the truth is reversed. Earth-based tech, stealth, drones, etc., was deployed as narrative camouflage to obscure the recovery and study of non-human artifacts. The prank narrative is a fallback, introduced only after whistleblower pressure, forced partial declassification. Sean Kirkpatrick's arrow is framed as an authority, but its output is filtered through classification constraints and executive edits. His discoveries regarding the so-called Yankee Blue indoctrination prank are not neutralizing disclosures. They are proof that the institutional machinery was used to psychologically condition officers to accept secrecy without comprehension. These rituals mirror cultic induction and not scientific protocol. Sean Kirkpatrick has now completely reversed the core assertion he's been making since 2023. For well over a year, he consistently told media outlets and interviewers that rumors of a secret UFO program were simply the product of a small group of devoted believers, amplified through an institutional game of telephone. Now, he's presenting a narrative that is quite literally the opposite. According to his updated account, the primary source of these long-standing beliefs wasn't rumor or belief, but rather a bizarre and far-reaching hazing ritual, one that allegedly persisted for decades and involved hundreds and hundreds of individuals. This new explanation directly contradicts his original position. To make matters even more convoluted, it's now being claimed that once Kirkpatrick uncovered this elaborate deception, the U.S. Air Force actively sought to suppress the truth, engaging in what amounts to a cover-up of a multi-decade prank. The shifting narrative raises serious questions about credibility, institutional integrity, and the lengths to which official channels are willing to go to maintain control over the conversation. This Wall Street Journal article operates as a strategic feedback loop designed to reinforce the prevailing narrative. It presents the illusion of disclosure while subtly reasserting psychological dominance over the conversation. This is not the unraveling of the official story. It's its reinforcement executed with precision. The true signal, found in isotopic analysis, credible testimony, and legislative action, is conspicuously absent. What we're offered isn't transparency, it's a controlled burn. The article reveals just enough to redirect belief, but carefully avoids anything that might penetrate the deeper vaults of secrecy. This is managed perception. The real unraveling is happening beyond its carefully drawn boundaries. Over the past several years, dozens of former military personnel, intelligence officers, defense contractors, and insiders have stepped forward to testify under oath or in official channels about the reality of NHI contact and reverse engineering efforts. Among them, just to name a few, Colonel Carl Nell, a highly respected former Army officer and aerospace executive, stated publicly that the U.S. is, in fact, in possession of recovered non-human craft and that the phenomenon is real. Commander David Fravor, Navy pilot, witnessed the now famous Tic Tac UFO performing maneuvers that defied known aeronautics and physics. Ryan Graves, another Navy pilot, testified that UFO encounters were so frequent that they became routine, and that these objects often operated in controlled U.S. airspace with impunity. David Grush, former intelligence officer, testified under oath to Congress that he was informed of a multi-decade crash retrieval program and the recovery of biologics of non-human origin. When Mr. Grush launched his own investigation into the UFO matter, he conducted interviews with over 40 witnesses over a 4-year period. He concluded that there was a there. Based on what we know of Grush, if this was all a result of purposefully planted falsified information and essentially rubbish, I personally believe his investigation would have found as much, and it found the opposite. These are not anonymous internet users or fringe theorists. People seem to forget that these are trained, vetted, and credentialed individuals with everything to lose and nothing to gain by coming forward. There are real-world implications to be had. Yet instead of addressing their testimonies, the Wall Street Journal article buries them beneath a narrative scaffold built on cherry-picked anecdotes of disinformation. The list of names goes on and on far beyond these individuals and deep into history. Jason Sands, Alex Dietrich, Kevin Day, Gary Voorhees, Gary Nolan, Sean Cahill, Com Kelleher, Tim Gallaudet, Paul Hellyer, Haim Ashed, Edgar Mitchell, Gordon Cooper, Donald Kehoe, Jesse Marcel, Clifford Stone, Kanchi Ishikawa, George F. Gorman, Bob Lazar. I could go further, trust and believe. Why not mention that some of these individuals gave their accounts to Congress, in public and behind closed doors, under the threat of perjury? Why not explore the details of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023, which specifically included provisions for whistleblower protections related to UFO programs? I'll tell you why. Because acknowledging these facts would shatter the illusion that this is all just a misunderstanding rooted in Cold War espionage tactics. It would force the mainstream to admit that there is a profound and unexplained reality here that cannot be reduced to folklore or misidentification. Another hallmark of deception is inconsistency. Over the decades, the U.S. government's position on UFOs has shifted wildly. First, they claimed there was nothing to investigate at all, not a damn thing. Then they said sightings were real, but misidentified conventional aircraft. Later, they admitted that UFOs exist, but aren't necessarily of concern. Now, they claim they may be foreign surveillance craft or misunderstood phenomena, all while redacting evidence and withholding key data from Congress and the public. Are you seeing a pattern yet? This whiplash-inducing sequence of revisions isn't just a byproduct of evolving knowledge. It's the institutional equivalent of gaslighting. They change the story just enough to keep the public confused, always retreating one step behind wherever consensus might be forming. But experiencers, researchers, and military witnesses are connecting the dots, and the picture is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What the Wall Street Journal completely ignores is the historical continuity of the phenomenon. This is not something that began in 1947, nor is it confined to American airspace or military installations. Throughout history, cultures across the globe have recorded interactions with otherworldly beings, craft in the sky, and impossible knowledge. These accounts are not always literal, and they should be interpreted within their cultural contexts, but the underlying consistency is impossible to dismiss. Something has been interacting with humanity for a very long time. To pretend this began and ends with a colonel in a Nevada bar handing out fake photos is intellectually dishonest and historically illiterate. Let's return to the article's core thesis that the UFO phenomenon is the result of decades of disinformation and internal confusion. This is the real trick. They want you to think the phenomenon itself is fake, when in reality, the fake part is their response to it. They are not revealing a buried truth. They are offering a sanitized explanation designed to inoculate the public against further curiosity. It's not a disclosure, it's a tranquilizer. And why now? Because interest is peaking. Because journalists, researchers, and independent investigators like myself have amassed a body of evidence that can no longer be ignored. Because the public is starting to take experiencers seriously. So what do? They pivot. They say, "Oh, you saw something strange? Don't worry. That was us all along. Just a prank, nothing to see here." Except there is everything to see here. We have now reached the point where denial is no longer credible. The evidence has reached critical mass. The testimonies keep coming. The patterns are too specific. The physics too exotic. And the impact on witnesses far too profound. We are being visited. Not by hallucinations, not by balloons, not by misidentified tech or government psyops, but by a non-human intelligence that appears deeply interested in our species, our behavior, and perhaps even our evolution. To deny this is to deny the voices of thousands upon thousands of credible witnesses. It is to deny radar returns, video footage, radiation burns, missing time, telepathic communication, and the entire rich, complicated body of data that spans centuries. I'd like to take a moment to consider this from another angle, just for the hell of it. The courtroom. If this were a trial, and we were to bring forward our case, complete with first-hand testimony, radar data, photographic and video evidence, corroborating sensor data, historical records, and professional expert witnesses, the evidence for the reality of UFOs and NHI presence would be overwhelming. We have eyewitnesses with impeccable credentials, including military officers, commercial airline pilots, radar operators, astronauts, government officials, police officers. You get the picture. We have data captured from multiple systems simultaneously, visual, infrared, and radar, all confirming the presence of craft with capabilities far beyond any known human technology. We have historical documentation that stretches back through centuries of recorded history and across every culture on this planet. And we have whistleblowers under oath, legally protected, and testifying before Congress. In a court of law, this would be called a preponderance of evidence. If not a smoking gun, it is certainly a room full of them. No reasonable jury presented with the full scope of this information would walk away believing that the phenomenon is simply a case of Cold War confusion and military misinformation. No chance. And yet, the Wall Street Journal article dares to imply that this is all nothing more than a byproduct of internal hoaxes and blurred lines of classified secrecy. That is not journalism. That is public relations for a narrative that is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Now it's time to play devil's advocate. To offer a generous interpretation, one might suggest that the Wall Street Journal article isn't debunking the UFO phenomenon at all. Rather, it may be attempting to expose the inner workings of a government system that has deliberately muddied the waters of disclosure. From this specific point of view, the article serves to highlight how military-driven disinformation campaigns were not only tools of Cold War strategy, but also mechanisms for controlling the public narrative around something much deeper. In this interpretation, the piece is not a dismissal of the phenomenon, but a subtle indictment of institutional secrecy. It acknowledges the machinery behind the myth-making, suggesting that the truth has been held hostage to protect technological advantages and national security interests. By focusing on the Pentagon's role in seeding false narratives, the article might be calling attention to a far more concerning question. If they went to such lengths to mislead the public, what are they still hiding? This lens does not excuse the article's omissions, but it reframes them. Perhaps the article is not the final word, but the first fissure in the wall of silence. A forced leak meant to prepare the public for whatever comes next. Still, we must remain vigilant. The risk is that such leaks function not as pathways to truth, but as carefully designed corridors that steer belief, reinforce ambiguity, and protect the architecture of secrecy. Until we breach that architecture fully, no interpretation can be accepted uncritically. You know what else strikes me as particularly telling about this article? The complete absence of cited sources for these so-called new revelations. The notion that alien narratives were merely cover for classified black-budget technology isn't new. It's been circulating for decades. Yet here, once again, it's presented without a shred of verifiable evidence to substantiate it or bring meaningful closure to the question. We're left with a series of uncorroborated assertions wrapped in the veneer of authority, but with no demonstrable proof. And of course, to even access the article, readers are met with a paywall, an added layer of gatekeeping around claims that are, at best, speculative without proper sourcing. Now, I understand that this very same argument is often used against the UFO phenomenon itself. People say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I don't disagree with that. Skepticism is vital. It's fair to ask for substantiation when someone claims something as world-shifting as contact with non-human intelligence. But here's the difference. When it comes to the UFO topic, we actually do have a trail of credible evidence. Data, documentation, radar returns, video footage, and first-hand accounts from seasoned military and intelligence personnel under oath. We have whistleblower testimony being given behind closed doors to members of Congress and the intelligence community. We have FOIA documents, isotopic analysis of anomalous materials, and corroborated events tracked across multiple sensor platforms. You may argue about the implications of that evidence, but you can't say it's non-existent. Meanwhile, this article offers no comparable standard of proof for its own sweeping assertions. It relies entirely on the authority of a few unnamed officials and a narrative that neatly exonerates decades of secrecy under the guise of national security. If the expectation is that UFO advocates must produce extraordinary evidence to be taken seriously, then surely the same standard should apply when claiming that an entire multi-decade phenomenon boils down to nothing more than internal pranks, misidentifications, and cleverly placed photos on a bar wall in the Nevada desert. That asymmetry in how evidence is treated is exactly what fuels continued distrust. The real mythology isn't that we're being visited. The real myth is that this can all be explained away with another conveniently timed article. If the Wall Street Journal wants to reclaim journalistic integrity, it should begin by talking to the witnesses, to experiencers, by studying the actual data, by challenging official statements rather than parroting them, by asking why, if there's nothing to this, so many people are still being silenced, ridiculed, and threatened for speaking up. Until then, their article remains what it is, a carefully scripted distraction meant to stifle truth, pacify the public, and pretend that the greatest mystery of our time can be chalked up to nothing more than clever misdirection. But we're not buying it any longer. We're not confused, we're not deceived, but we are being visited.